Welcome back to the Health Physics Society's video series pursuing the truth and promoting transparency regarding the historical foundations of the current radiation protection philosophy based on a linear no-threshold theory for cancer risk assessment. I'm Dr. John Cardarelli, President of the Health Physics Society. In the 11th episode, we described how the National Academy of Sciences created 6 committees to study the biological effects of atomic radiation, otherwise known as the Baer Committees, and the influential role of the Rockefeller Foundation. In this episode, we will take a closer look at one of those committees, the Genetics Committee, and how they came to a conclusion that there was a linear relationship between radiation dose and gene mutations. Were their actions transparent and objective? Was there scientific misconduct? Watch and decide for yourself.
I wanted to ask, the committee obviously had already made up its mind, the Genetics Committee, on where they were going to come down. So what did they do with the rest of their time working on this committee?
Well, what happened was that Warren Weaver, the person who was the director of the committee, he decided to give them an assignment. This was all the geneticists on the committee. Now, the committee was made up of about 17 people, but 13 of them were true blue geneticists. And as it turns out, one had to drop off because of academic work, and he couldn't continue, with the committee. So they really had 12. Now, so what he did was that this was in the first week in February of 1956. He assigned them to estimate the number of birth defects in the U.S. population. And at that time, there was about 160 million people in the U.S. back in 1956, right? And so if their gonads were exposed to a certain level of radiation. And so he gave them the chance to write this up over the next month and wanted it to be turned in before their next meeting, which would be taking place in the first week in March. And so he knew that they were all different kinds of geneticists. They were drawn in from the world of bacterial genetics and the world of fruit fly genetics and mouse genetics and a range of human genetics, clinical genetics, things of that nature. And Tracy Sonneborn, I remember him stating that, well, it's good that we're all different because we have different methodologies for how we do our studies and how we analyze things. And if we have a convergence of our views, then that actually adds a lot greater strength to anything that we would have to say, because we've seen it somewhat all independently. And so they were given the 30 days to do this. They only had to make one assumption. And that assumption was a very important one. They had to assume that the dose response was linear down to a single ionization. But that's a very significant assumption, because if you assumed it was threshold or something else, your results could be much wider and all over the place. But they all had to assume it was going to be linear, so that should have been something that would have brought them all together. And so what happened is that there were 12 people who were going to provide these, but 3 of them, including Neil, decided that this assignment was just an improper assignment. It was the data weren't there to do it. It was too much uncertainty, and they chose not to do it, wouldn't waste their time doing it. And they were pretty clear about that. The other 9 decided that they would do it. And so they all got their write-ups in, and I have to admit to you that I have all 9.
Where was the data drawn from?
The data was drawn from their own experience. They had to go into the literature. They had to use their own methods. They had to use their own creativity. And I'd have to tell you that those who were population geneticists used population genetics methodologies. Those who were Drosophila geneticists based things on Drosophila. Others based theirs on bacteria, things of that nature. It really took into account the unique creativity and experience of the individual. So a bacterial or fruit fly geneticist could not at all address this problem from a population-based perspective. They had to use their own way of trying to figure it out.
So they were all analyzing human genetic mutation.
They were trying to answer the question that he posed, which was a human question. and that was how many birth defects are we going to find in the next and in 10 more generations? And they gave them a couple of little permutations to figure out more complicated problems. But that was really the issue. And so they all. What I did was I was able to, because I tried to get all their correspondence, not just from the National Academy, but I tried to get all the correspondence between each member to each other. So it was quite a wide network, and I got a lot of duplications because they were sending the same thing back to each other and across. But it was good because it made sure that I got complete sets of information. And so what happened was quite a surprise. There was a member on the committee. He was from the University of Wisconsin, and his name is James Crow. And I'd have to tell you that the only person on that committee that I ever personally communicated with was Jim Crow. And when I did this, it was around 2012, and it started with, I was writing one of my papers about Mueller. And it was the halftime of a Super Bowl football game in which the Patriots were playing. And so I said, well, I'm going to, it's a halftime, so I could sneak away to the computer, and I wrote to Jim Crow, and I told him who I was, and I was writing a paper on Mueller and his history and the Nobel Prize speech and things of that nature. And would he read this? And so he wrote me back within like 3 minutes. And he was 94 and a half years old, and he was lucid, and I'll read it right away, and so forth and so on. So it began my relationship with Jim Crow, the last living survivor of this committee, and more on that a little bit later. But Crow's job, and he was young, so he was kind of given like almost a administrative, little secretarial sort of collating job by Warren Weaver. And so when all these geneticists turned their stuff in, they sent it to him, and he would make some charts and collate things. Wouldn't make any judgments, just kind of make it easier for everybody to analyze what the results would be. And so when they all came in, he was pretty shocked because he learned, he said, gosh, he said, none of these people agree with each other. They're all over the place. There's so much variability. Even if we all agreed on linearity, it didn't. I don't know how broad and how expansive our uncertainty would be across the group. And so, but this really bothered him quite a bit because he said, if we can't agree amongst each other, and we're so-called the experts in this field for the country, then if we can't agree with each other, then people are going to look at us and say, well, how can we believe anything that you say because you don't agree with each other? That you can't get a consistent anything out of this group if you're not on the same page with each other. And so he informed Weaver that they had a problem. It's a serious problem. It wasn't a trivial problem. And if they had just stayed with Connolly no longer meetings, they wouldn't have had that problem. They would have just all agreed on LNT and go home and do your policy that way. But they found that all these people that agreed on LNT, they didn't agree with how to use it, how it could be used, or anything about it. They were exposing their own lack of knowledge and insights and confusion. It's really exposing a lot of confusion. And so what happened was that this was a problem. And so what happens next in this story is that on his own, James Crow decides to remove the 3 lowest or most varying estimates. So he just dumps them, and they happen to be the bacterial one and the 2 human ones. And he's left with people that have used Drosophila and mice. And that's really it. And so, and with that, they brought something that was many, many thousands of fold variation down to about 750 fold difference. And that was still considered too big. It was
pretty big.
Yeah, they were not happy with that. And you couldn't, then remove another one. I mean, what becomes of your sample, right? And so without offering any written explanation, they made a de facto move like, it's like your father says, no, we're going to the beach today, and it's this beach. No rationale, we're just going to go and do this, right? And so they just made a decision that they would reduce the 750 down to 100-fold.
By
by Fiat. There was no scientific basis for it.
They just divided by 750?
Well, there wasn't even, that's giving them too much. They made a judgment, and the judgment was going to be 100.
So they didn't have to present the data anywhere and demonstrate that it was actually 100.
Oh, you raise a very interesting question, because they had to confront the issue of, well, if you're going to come up with numbers, do we provide the scientific foundation for for our judgment? And the committee had a discussion on that, and they decided that they would not provide any scientific justification because they didn't have one. They didn't do any. And they'd have to do it after the fact, which is even kind of worse. It's kind of like, reconstructing the crime after you have committed it, right? It's one thing to say, this is the thoughts that led up to it, but in fact, they didn't do that. Now, I'd like to just, on that one point, fast forward about 8 or 9 months, because one of the committee members, Bentley Glass, he was approached by a number of high-level biologists on the East Coast from the New Jersey, Princeton area. And they demanded, because they had read their report that had come out subsequently in June of that year, they wanted to have a written justification. They wanted to see the basis for this, because the report that they had was more policy-oriented conclusions and explanations, but not a scientific basis. And they wanted a scientific basis. And so what happened is that they still were insistent upon not doing it. And this becomes very significant. And it was then, the first one wasn't bumped up to the head of the National Academy. They just made a decision as a committee, no, we're not going to do a rationalization, justification. But the second one was actually bumped up to Detlev Bronk. I mean, the head of the National Academy. And guess what? Detlev Bronk says, you don't have to write it. And so there was no justification written for it. He just abdicated his responsibility as the person in charge of the National Academy of Sciences. That's our leadership at that time. And so what happened was that the committee came forth with they were down to now 100, and that was really it. So they had a report that they had to write, and they had every one of the 6 committees, they had a connection to the Journal of Science. And they were all going to have a separate article that was going to be published in Science, the one from the medical group, the one from the ocean waste disposal group and atmospheric group, and there'd be one from the genetics group. And so the genetics group wrote theirs and published it in the Journal of Science. And so one day I am reading their report, and I'm mostly getting through it, and then I read this curious paragraph. This is actually pretty amazing. It's kind of like one of these moments that happens. It's kind of like when you find Mueller's November 12th letter to Stern. Well, I'm reading this report, and just picture it yourself. Now, I have the nine reports, and they're all in detail. And I have them here in this room today, as a matter of fact. And I'm reading this, and it says, and we challenged our geneticists, and there were 12 of them, to estimate the number of birth defects that would happen if the U.S. population was exposed to a certain level of gonads, to a certain level of radiation. And 6 of them took up the challenge.
I thought 9 of them.
Exactly. I'm reading this, and my memory isn't the greatest in the world sometimes, and you read things and it slips over. But I kind of knew that I had read 9, if you know what I mean. I knew it wasn't 6. And so I might not for sure have known it was 9, but I knew it was more than 6. And I knew that I had more. So I went to my files, and sure enough, I had 9. And I identified all the 9. And these weren't trivial one-page deals, one-paragraph deals. These were people who took the assignment from Weaver seriously. They wrote reports. They did calculations. They did it from their own perspective. They might have expressed frustration with how hard it was, or how uncertain it was, or however they did this, and they weren't certain. Everyone had their own how they approached it. But 9 of them did it. Okay? 9. And those are the ones that that Crow had seen, and they were all disagreed with each other. And so
that's where the 3,000-fold uncertainty.
More than that. And so as it turns out, I go and I look and I said, well, why did they say that there were 6 and there were 9? How could that happen, actually? Because I know that Crow removed 3. And so, I wasn't sure. I knew that they had lost it. So I had to go back in and figure out how it happened. And so, as it turns out now, what you have as an example, and this is an example of that National Academy of Sciences committee altering the research record when they decided to publish their findings of their activities within the Science Journal. There weren't 9, there were 6. Why were there 6? Because it reduced the level of uncertainty.
So they took out the 3.
They took out the 3 that were the lowest. That's right. I identified them all, and then by Fiat and they don't explain that. By Fiat they bring it down to to 10 to 100-fold for the uncertainty, and they do not mention to the science readership that 3 other people on the committee thought that it was so wildly uncertain that they refused to even grace the assignment, and they didn't even follow what the chairman asked them to do. They refused to do it. So there was even more uncertainty than what we actually even have. And so this committee then essentially lied to the American public, to the scientific community. They misrepresented their level of uncertainty, and they did that because they wanted to give the impression that there was a lot more unity in their perspective, and therefore their recommendations for LNT and other things that they were going to recommend could be agreed upon and accepted. And so what they did in that science publication was to actually have scientific misconduct. And under a normal circumstance in scientific misconduct, you lose your job. The paper gets retracted. You don't become called by, like as the New York Times would say, this is the dream team of geneticists recommending things to the country. This was the opposite of the dream team. This was a team that had an ideology, and they wanted to ensure that ideology was carried out with respect to a policy change, and it was really led by Mueller. And they would go so far as not taking into consideration Neil study and others, and everyone, even Neil, everyone on that committee committed scientific misconduct. They were aware of what happened. It wasn't that they somebody wrote the minority report and they distanced themselves from everything. They were all co-authors to this, and these were big time players in the game. And so what happened is that this goes forth, and it becomes a very influential document.
Now, when was this published?
It's published in June 12th of 1956.
Okay. I just want to skip where I am in the timeline.
They made front page story in the Washington Post, front page story in the New York Times, a big story in U.S. News and World Report, big all over the place, actually.
Claiming
exactly what they said, that linearity was the story, the big change. There should be a big change in policy, that the AEC was misrepresenting the actual risks. Things had to change. This is what Mueller wanted. It probably was what the Rockefeller Foundation wanted. They handpicked their people for whatever reason. There may be within the deep thinkers that were on the Rockefeller Foundation board, but they stacked the deck. They created the situation, and then when they, as scientists, scientists will always show the basis of what their thinking is, but this group decided not to do that, and so within very short time, various recommendations were made to adopt LNT, and then the LNT was very quickly modified from just that of a genetic concern tied into transgenerational birth defect questions, as serious as all that is. But it was then transformed into concern for somatic injury and cancer. And so this became the driving force for what would happen for cancer risk assessment. And this document, in my opinion, becomes the most significant document in cancer risk assessment in the history of the world. And it came out of a group that committed scientific misconduct. Now, I'd have to tell you that having learned all this, I requested that the editor of Science retract this paper.
This 1956?
This 1956 paper, and I made that request in 2015 to Marcia McNutt, who was the editor-in-chief of Science. She's now the president of the National Academy of Sciences.
I thought her name sounded familiar.
Yeah, she's, I think, from California, one of the universities out there, and so forth. And I presented my case to her, like I've made a case today in our discussions, that there was fraudulent activity on behalf of this committee, and that it was falsification of the research record. It was very significant because it affected change in policy, and that policy had been continued over 60 years, and that Science should retract it. By not retracting it, they're endorsing it. And that paper is continuously being used and promoted around the world.
It's still cited today, I imagine.
Well, it is the basis, and I remember when there was a fellow, Roy Albert, who was the chair of the EPA's Cancer Assessment Group when EPA was young, back in the 50s, and he was there for about 10 or 15 years as chair of that group. And in his reflections of EPA and their transition, when they became like a big-time organization and they had to address cancer, they said they went right back to the NAS and they selected the recommendation from the National Academy of Sciences. And while EPA was very interested in radiation and would address radiation, they also had to address chemicals. And they adopted the recommendation. They just transferred that linearity recommendation from radiation to chemicals because both worked through mutation and both were linear all the way. And so what you have is a fait accompli, that that the reach of Muller was a very long reach. And it has reached from really 1930 and the creation of the proportionality rule to 2021. It's 90 years, 91 years, and going strong. And so there's more to the story, but this is the setup, and this is the regulatory foundation, the history of the regulatory foundation for LNT. And there is more dishonesty and more consequences that will happen in the subsequent unveiling of this story and with this committee.
I have been in the field of health physics for over 25 years, and I have seen the consequences of the application of LNT. I've seen it in the reticence of people to get medically necessary exams. I've seen it in the expense of some of our cleanups that are done around the country. So I think it is crucial for us to have an understanding of how this came into being and to begin to reevaluate using that policy going into the future.
If you think that the story is kind of bad up to the present time, it will only get worse as we approach the present. The dishonesties and the misrepresentations actually didn't end in 1956 with the Bayer Committee. They continued this, and we'll look at that more in the next session.
Thank you for watching the 12th episode on the historical foundations of the linear no-threshold theory, where we learned that the challenge put forth to 12 members of the genetics panel to estimate the number of adverse genetic effects via birth defects resulting from a radiation dose of 0.1 gray resulted in huge uncertainties. In fact, 3 of the 12 geneticists refused to even take on this challenge, and another 3 members who had the lowest estimates had their results removed in an effort to reduce the uncertainty, which decreased it from about 4,000-fold difference down to about a 750-fold difference. Still, that uncertainty was too large, and they agreed to state that the uncertainty was about a 100-fold difference, without providing any justification. And this decision was approved by Detlev Bronk, the president of the National Academy of Sciences. The genetics panel produced their report, and it was published in Science, receiving worldwide attention by major news outlets. However, what the readers didn't know is how they misrepresented the scientific activities by leaving out important details that 3 geneticists refused to take on the challenge, falsely stating that only 6 of the 12 geneticists on the panel took on the challenge, when in fact 9 did, and fabricating an uncertainty value of 100-fold without providing a justification, when in fact the uncertainty was at least 750-fold. Finally, Dr. Calabrese accused this committee of scientific misconduct, and in 2015 requested that their famous article be retracted from Science. Marcia McNutt, current president of the National Academy of Sciences, rejected the call for a retraction, providing her reasons, which are detailed in a 2017 article by Dr. Calabrese. The genetics panel article had a profound impact on future regulatory and policy development in the United States, such that retraction could serve as the beginning of the end of the reliance on the LNT model for human risk assessment. The story continues in our next episode, where we will learn how this belief in an LNT dose-response relationship influenced government regulations and policies all the way through to the present time. The HPS is a trusted source of radiation information. We're a scientific organization, and as is offered with a scientific peer review process, viewers are encouraged to send comments or suggested corrections to factcheck@hps.org, and be sure to include your sources so that we may correct the record if necessary. If any changes are made, they will appear at the end of this episode. Please visit our Ask the Experts website to ask questions or seek answers to common radiation-related questions, and view our fact sheets. We also have official position statements that can be found at hps.org. Finally, if you wish to join the Home for Radiation Protection Professionals, please visit the link below. We welcome you.